Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 74 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Anger mingled with hopelessness in Janir's chest. Her brother was going to get them both killed. Why did he always have to act as if he had the upper hand? They reached the spot where Malkalar had stood. There was but a faint outline of his boots, much shallower prints than Janir would have expected for someone his size. Lucan faltered, so briefly that Janir wasn't sure he had faltered at all. Without another word, he strode off in the same direction as the elf. Did her brother think that because he had once taken Seavan captive, that all elves must be weaklings? Besides, he had only taken Seavan because of the Carcatan. Neither brother nor sister had that advantage now. If she hadn't feared the noise would alert Malkalar, she would have demanded Lucan turn around, maybe even fought him. She also thought of going off and demanding her brother simply follow, but Lucan would call her bluff. It occurred to her that she could go off on her own anyway, but she wouldn't leave him. So they followed Malkalar. The elf never came into sight, but his shallow dust prints guided the way, his stagnant magic safely ahead of them. Despite his jibes, Lucan made pains to be quiet as well. He moved cautiously and peered around every corner. A low murmur pierced the stillness. Lucan paused and listened. Janir followed suit. It was faint, barely audible above the thrum of Janir's own heart, but she could hear a single voice reciting in a language she didn't recognize. The voice was strangely familiar and made her think of silver, the purest and finest silver, frosted with ice. For though the voice was beautiful, there was something else in it, something foreboding. Janir took a deep breath. Lucan followed in the general direction of the voice. Janir's pulse thrummed with anxiety. They were turned around a few times, and Lucan stumbled on what might have been a shin bone. Soon the voice became louder and clearer, and Janir only reaffirmed that she had never heard the language before. The light in the passage increased, a welcoming glow. With it, the presence of Malkalar's magic. This new light was tinted orange, as though from candles and lamps. They wound through the dark corridors, and the stone around them had gradually become newer and cleaner, better maintained. Janir noted they appeared to be reaching the younger portion of the catacombs, the portion closer to the actual temple. A bright light to the side caught their attention, and they plodded toward it. Even though she feared Malkalar, hope of finally breaking free of the temple's necropolis was irresistible. The silvery voice was growing louder, and it seemed to be straight ahead, coming from the same direction as the light. Janir and Lucan reached a collection of pillars and stern statues set about a circular room. They kept behind the large statues to remain unseen. A flare of red magic rose suddenly, and Janir balked. Within the circular room, hundreds of candles illuminated the stone. In the center of the room was a small pillar, with symbols and spells written in chalk on the floor around it. Atop the pillar was a familiar object, its bronze lid securely bolted down. A large vein ran through the chalice's bowl and down its stem. The crack Janir had created when she attacked it with her power. Standing over the chalice with his hands hovering on either side was the elf. He chanted lowly, his voice rumbling, rising, and falling. It struck Janir he was perfect in every way. From the set of his jaw, the flawlessness of his skin, the delicate point of his ears, the wiry leanness of his body, to the silky locks of ebony rolling down his back. Janir had never seen a more beautiful man, and yet There was something else about him. Something she couldn't name. Something she couldn't name. Janir had met this man before. She couldn't say where or when or how. But she had a reason to fear him. She crouched down as quietly as she could beside Lucan, peering from between the entwined arms of two statues. She wasn't sure why Malkalar was here or what his intentions were, but every one of her instincts screamed at her to get down and keep from being seen. This time, Lucan obliged. The dark elf was distracted by his task, whatever it was, yet he still glanced up from his work. Janir had to hold in a gasp. His eyes were so pale blue that they were almost white, only adding to the air of the otherworldly about him. Janir hunkered down lower, clutching her constancy star as though for protection. She crammed her knuckles into her mouth and bit down to keep quiet. Why the presence of Malkalar frightened her so much. The elf went back to chanting, his voice resuming its melodic repetitions. Janir ached for Savan, and for him to tell her who this was and why she was as terrified of him as she was of her father. Maybe even more. Did the Lord Argatalam and Jorman Nufar know about Malkalar's presence? Had they recruited him, or had he come of his own volition? Whether or not they had sought him out, what was he doing? Silence descended on the room, an eerie, empty silence that brought gooseflesh to Janir's skin. Janir peered carefully around the edge of the statue. Malkalar had vanished. Without a sound or a sight or a breath of magic to mark his departure, the elf was gone. She could not even sense his power. Where did he go? Lucan whispered. Moving ever so slowly and taking care to make as little noise as possible, Janir rose. A second glance around the chamber proved that it was still empty, just them and the chalice. Janir. Lucan's voice took on a cautioning note. Janir, don't try it. Malkalar or no, Janir needed to take the chalice of Malvern so that the Slavish couldn't use it again. She would prefer to destroy it, since she didn't completely trust the Brevians not to use it. The High Lords might be mostly decent men, but she doubted that any of them would object to invading Slavin for a change. But the screams of the dying Slavish men were still fresh in her memory. They had lived and loved as anyone else. She had seen enough of their dying thoughts to know that. Invasion was invasion, no matter who did it. It was one thing to defend your country, another entirely to pillage someone else's. Innocents would be murdered either way, and that was one thing Janir couldn't endure. She wondered if she would be punished for this, and she realized it didn't matter. If she could stop a war a second time, it would be worth it. Or so she hoped. Crossing the room, Janir stepped over the symbols on the floor, recognizing some of them from the spell books Carlisle had read back in Lares. The Lord Argatalam had said that they were repairing the chalice. Janir wondered how they could do that, seeing as how the power inside came from a very specific source. But it was her lot to destroy magic. Understanding it was optional. Get away from that! Lucan flew at her from behind, grabbing her arm and trying to wrestle her away. Janir gritted her teeth. I'm sorry. She drove her elbow into Lucan's cracked ribs. He doubled over, groaning. Guilt stabbed through her. I'm so sorry. She hated doing that to him, and she doubted there was anything else that could have made her do it, but there was too much at stake. Janir came mere inches from the chalice. The broken relic glowed with a faint, sickly orange, nothing like the strong, pulsing light it had possessed before she broke it. Janir picked up the chalice. A slight tremor rattled through the symbols and spells on the floor, and the chalice hummed ever so slightly, but nothing else happened. She gripped the relic in both hands. She reached out to the magic, testing it. The power inside was much weaker now, but she could still sense Malvern's presence, his roiling, baseless anger. She withdrew, cringing. According to the ancient writ, Malvern was supposed to control violence and bloodlust, but like fire, it had consumed him. Even as she contemplated fire, Magic flared at her back and something cold pressed against her skin. Janir gasped as the steel of a sylvan blade rested lightly against her throat. The sharp edge could slash her veins with but a flick of the wielder's wrist. Her heart raced. She shivered with fear. She followed the blade to the man, grasping the hilt. Malkalar stood with a square stance, angling the blade to slash her throat.
You have set back my plans for the last time, Janir Caerson Argatalam.
Janir shivered. He knew her name. How did he know her name? Then again, how did she know his? Who are you? Lucan wheezed from the floor.
Put the chalice back as it was.
Malkalar pressed the blade harder, just enough to remind her how easily he could open her veins. Janir trembled, but she did as he said. She tried to think, tried to find a way out of this. She had survived 2 attempts on her life in the past 12 hours. Did that mean she could get out of this one? Or did it mean her luck had run out?
Good girl.
He purred. Lucan straightened, clambering to his knees. Get her away from the chalice, but she's not to be harmed. Malkalar landed a kick to Lucan's injured side. Lucan made a strangled, whimpering sound that was so much worse than a scream. Don't touch him! Janir shrieked. She tried to reach for her brother, but Malkalar's blade stopped her short.
As if you did not do the same.
He flicked out his second sword and leveled it under Lucan's chin. Up. Lucan groaned, but clawed his way upright. Fresh guilt poured through Janir at his pallid face. He looked too tired to fight anymore. Malkalar herded them to stand side by side.
Now step back against the wall.
Janir took a small step back along with her brother. Her mind whirled. Why did he want them back to the wall? Why not kill them right here? She doubted he planned to leave them alive. Janir searched the room hastily then. The symbols on the floor held faint glimmers of power. They were magic. If Malkalar cut their throats here, their blood would spill on them, and there was enough power in her blood alone that it could very well disable the chalice. Malkalar was an enchanter. He would not risk physical contact with an Argatalam, and that left him with his sword. Yet because of the chalice, he wouldn't kill them so long as their blood would get on the runes. Or so she hoped. She stopped.
I did not tell you to stop.
Malkalar jabbed the blade harder against her throat. Janir inhaled deeply. Impulse told her to obey him, but her mind told her that this was the best chance she had. What do you want? She squeaked. Get back against the wall. He snarled. No. Her voice came out as more of a whimper than a command. Nearly paralyzed in fear, it was a miracle she could speak at all. Lucan, don't leave the rune circle. Malkalar made a sound that seemed more befitting for a mountain beast. He jammed the blade even harder against her neck, then jerked back abruptly, before it broke her skin. Janir let off a quick breath of relief. She was right. The elf's teeth gnashed in frustration. He blinked several times, as though seeing a mirage. His nostrils flared. Where did you get that? He demanded, the tip of his sword clicking lightly against the constancy star. Janir didn't answer. Lucan coughed, holding his side. Who gave it to you? Malkalar's knuckles went white on his sword hilts. Lucan ducked under Malkalar's sword and smashed a fist into the elf's face. Simultaneously, his boot connected with the elf's groin. Malkalar cursed in Elvish. Following up the advantage, Janir skirted out of the sword's reach and made a pass for Malkalar's neck. If she could just touch Bearskin, she could do to him what every enchanter feared from her kind. Malkalar retreated across the room. Janir pursued him and only realized at the last second that he was drawing her out of the circle of runes. She fell back to stand beside Lucan. Malkalar swore again, confirming her suspicions. Malkalar glared at her, with a hatred intense as the fires of 1,000 stars. Lucan was a forgotten trifle. Who gave that to you? He seemed more concerned with the star now than anything else. Which of my kinsmen? Who has been defiled with the flesh of an Argotolum? Janir bristled. She and Seovan hadn't even kissed yet, and it was none of this bastard or anyone else's business if they had. Lucan arched one eyebrow and shot Janir a look that she passionately disliked. Malkalar seethed. This is an abomination. Janir glared right back at him. Something her father had said sprang into her mind. The chalice had been kept in the treasury of the Elven King for hundreds of years. He had never mentioned exactly how that had changed. She glanced to the chalice. Malkalar had not tried to reclaim it, but rather stopped her from destroying it. Realization came crashing down. You were the one who gave them the chalice. Malkalar's brows twitched. What did they give you in exchange, Malkalar? She demanded. What did it take for you to betray the people of Brevia? The ones your kind swore to aid and protect? Lucan stiffened. How do you know my name? Malkalar's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. What, by all the essences, is this? If it hadn't been for the runes and her being an Argotolum, Janir was sure Malkalar would have strangled her and run her through with his sword for good measure. I don't know, Janir honestly replied. She couldn't see why he would be so livid and alarmed at the same time, but it made her feel as though she held a secret. Lucan glanced between the two of them. What the hell is happening? He was baffled. He was not baffled very often. Janir didn't know how to answer that, so she kept her attention on Malkalar. What do you want? Why would you do this? Malkalar leaned forward, frothing with malice. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. To purify. Chills shot down her spine. Voices clamored from behind her. Janir glanced around to see an archway leading up into the main portion of the temple. She must have been too distracted to notice. Footsteps, rustling garments, and urgent shouts neared. They brought with them the glimmer of magic. Next time, Argotolum. Malkalar growled. Next time, I will end you. I only hope that there will be time for me to do it deliberately. Janir turned around to face him, only to find herself alone with her brother. There was no trace of the elf. Not even a whisper of magic.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.